And our first speaker is Mervyn Taylor. So Mervyn, if you'd like to get ready, as they say. I've known Mervyn for a long, long time. I'm not going to give a long introduction. You can read his bio there. But Mervyn has been involved in a number of different areas and bringing his expertise to a number of different areas. He was certainly, where I knew him, was involved in the hospice-friendly hospitals programme and did tremendous work there in terms of palliative care. And now he's with Sage. He's a service manager with Sage. And certainly his credibility in the area and his credibility in terms of expertise, in terms of what he brings, I'm looking forward to hearing him. So Mervyn, if you step up. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eamon. You did say that you were inviting people to speak who knew what they were talking about. Under the Trade Descriptions Act, I have to say a word of caution about myself. But first of all, I want to thank Mary and the Employment Lawyers Association for the invitation to speak here. And the work of Sage is kind of, it's not fiche línig fás, it's almost fiche law, as you'll hear in the course of this. But I wanted to kind of, as there were so many lawyers here, and I'm not a lawyer, but I thought I would kind of provoke. You've seen this many times. Every preacher has to have a text, and my text is drawn from the book of Dickens. Dickens, I think, could be seen by some as being very sentimental, but actually he was probably one of the greatest advocates. The results of his writing can be seen in many, many laws which were published, changing public policy, changing attitudes. And what he said about bad people and good lawyers could also be said about in relation to advocates. If the world was perfect, we'd have no need for advocates. If everything was perfect, there'd be no need for advocates. And I suppose part of the question, what I want to talk about today in this, talking about these two bookends of Lees Cross and Ars Attracta, is really to try and put out a few questions about what role does advocacy have to play, and is it advocacy that we actually need to be talking about at times, but also to talk about what we are trying to develop. Dickens, interestingly, visited Ireland 3 times, and he stayed in the Morrison Hotel, and this is the only connection I can personally make with Dickens. And the Morrison Hotel is where Parnell also used to stay, with or without Mrs. O'Shea. And it's on the corner, it's now the old bank, Costa Coffee at the bottom of Nassau Street, and it was there that Parnell was arrested in 1881 to be brought to Kilmainham and the famous Kilmainham Treaty. But Dickens stayed there, and the Irish Hospice Foundation had their office there. And it was downstairs is Kevin and Howland, and it's because of that I got a great deal on this suit, and that's my only connection to Dickens. But it is interesting to think that you once walked on the same corridors as Charles Dickens and Parnell. And I thought it was useful to actually talk about some great historical figures, because in many ways Dickens died in 1870, and he wrote one great book about Bleak House, and you'll see the name Jarndyce, and of course all looks yellow to the Jarndyce eye, but it was a very, very big swipe at what was going on in the law. And the interesting thing is, 144 years later, one of the greatest challenges we face is actually legislation that came in Ireland the year after Dickens died, but he had been writing about that issue in English law and almost both satirising it and exploring it in a brilliant story. And I thought I'd just take that Bleak House theme across to a decade, sort of bookends of this decade. Lees Cross, in May of this year, it'll be 10 years since the famous Lees Cross film. And indeed it was a shocker, and it really was seen as a bleak house. And very recently, not too many months ago, we were all stunned again with the Ars Attracta. Again, it was an RTE film, cameras came in. There are 5 people who are wards of court in that, in Ars Attracta. I just want to put those 2 bleak houses together as the end of the beginning and end of a sort of a particular decade. and how people responded to it and what we might learn out of that. But I suppose in drawing attention to those two bleak houses, I have to say, for balance, that it's most of the horrors or the difficulties occur in the bleak homes. Just that is a simple fact. SAGE has arisen from Lees Cross, and I'll explain more of that in a few moments. But its mission there is to promote and protect the rights, freedoms and dignity of older people by developing support and advocacy services wherever ageing poses a challenge for individuals. So it is not just about nursing home, it's wherever ageing poses a challenge. That's an important point, and it moves us away from what our origins were, which were in Lees Cross itself. And just, I'm not going to go through all of this timeline. In fact, my colleague, Dr. Meta Reid here, who was one of the early pioneers of advocacy for older people in west of Ireland, could speak much more knowledgeably about the development of the service. But I think it is important to note that 2005 in May was the programme. It was, Des O'Neill did a report, an initial report on aspects of care in 2006. 2007 we had the government establishing a commission of inquiry. Now if you think about it, the Áras Attracta timeline, we're just a couple of months out. How long will this process actually take? People seem to think that in retrospect everything is telescoped, that HICWA came in and everything was, it was all part of a great plan. HICWA was being planned anyway. So it was HICWA was established in 2007. It didn't actually start till 2009 inspecting nursing homes. So it's useful to remember the time sequence. The HSE in 2007, and I hope there may have been some moves early in 2006, but 2007 it formally established this Forum on Older People. So the ideas of advocacy service are to be there for older people actually originated, it wasn't just a HSE thing, it actually came out of the, if you like, the non-government sector in many ways. And I suppose the interesting point is there that it was 2009 by the time the final report on Lees Cross was published. 4 years later. That's how long some of these things take, and that's how momentum gets lost out of the process of change. Everybody is incensed, and then there's another crisis, and then there's a report, and then we have to wait for something, and then we have to wait for something else. But it is it's just to remind you, it does take time and question whether it should or not. We are literally at this stage here at the end of last year, there were discussions finally moving together with Atlantic, and there was an agreement to redevelop the original advocacy service set up as a response to Lees Cross just prior, well actually as Áras Attracta was happening. So that's almost a decade later. So you're redeveloping that which was originally developed in the response to Lees Cross. And it's only since September that the National Advisory Committee, chaired by Patricia Rickard Clark, that actually first met, and the staff actually orientation began. That's a decade. I think there's two bookends: Lees Cross, Áras Attracta. It's just interesting to be reminded of how long some things can take. There's also this point about advocacy came on the agenda in that period. It's formally, from the point of view of nursing homes, it's there in the regulations arising out of the Health Act of 2007, where possible, insofar as is reasonably practical, there's access to independent advocacy services. So there's the system, the NGOs, everybody has seen that there's some role for advocacy. But I think the question, if you go down through all of those things, people have, I think, presumed that advocacy was the answer. But I wonder what was the question that they were trying to answer. First of all, the first model, Napa, was over-reliant on volunteers and very little attention to support infrastructure. So there was a great cavalry charge of the heart to do something, but the actual infrastructure to maintain it wasn't there. It then was reviewed. Citizens Information Board were asked would they be interested because they had a model of core paid staff and volunteers, and they weren't interested. It moved. It then went out for expressions of interest. Third Age, an NGO that I'm employed by, got it, but the resources didn't come with it, and it went into survival mode. The National Advocacy Service came out of the Citizens Information Board for people under 65 with disabilities, core staff and no volunteers. That's my understanding of the situation. Now, I'm really just putting, and then there's a National Advocacy Unit of the HSE, which is now, I think, closing down, and that's going into staff and patient participation, and they themselves, those two units, staff and patient participation, may themselves be divided out into two other particular strands. So it's actually, all I'm trying to do is to outline that it's a sort of a checkered history. It's not like there's some coherent path and that somebody somewhere has done the wrong thing and we didn't quite get it right. I'm really just raising the question as to whether we knew, or whether it was ever, the question was ever asked, what did we want to achieve, and were there other ways of achieving it? There's the perennial question of what is advocacy. I was told the other day of a group that met for a year to define what they meant by advocacy. And after a year, they decided that they agreed on that there was a working definition. So what's the difference between a working definition and another definition? But it just, I think some of this sort of Taliban type thinking, as I kind of, it's looking for this eternal truth, the final statement. Sometimes it can be a bit of it can miss the core point, and that is about voice. There are many, the roots of it are in Middle English, French, Latin, Greek, essentially about giving voice to call, vocation. If you look at to give voice, suffrage, the word, vocations, patron, the Latin word for advocate, if Google translation is right. The fact of the matter here is just many people use the word and see themselves as advocates, and that's fine. But we can spend a lot of time trying to define it, and it really has to be, in a way, situation specific. And some people see the role of advocacy and they act in an advocacy sort of role, and they mightn't even recognise it. Included in that would be some people who made complaints directly to HICWA. And under the Freedom of Information Act, Fergus O'Dowd, who's now a backbencher, but in fairness to him, has been very interested in nursing homes long before it was genuinely profitable or popular. There were 206, I think, I counted on the kind of the redacted forms that came back. But it's an interesting view of what some people might, sorry, if I can go back there. It's not necessarily the pages, just to give you a sense, this is the sort of stuff that you see. It's not it isn't substantiated, but it gives you a real sense of what people were complaining about. Some of them could be extremely biased, but in all, they give you an insight that would make you wonder. And here's just a couple of words taken out, quotes out of various case number, nursing home 203. The service provider was reluctant to allow the complainant come and meet its resident as they already have their own advocate within house. So in other words, game, set and match, this is our advocate and we will determine, and if they push it too far, they're not going to get paid. So clearly that's one view of what an advocate is, which is it's our tame dog and the dog will bark for us. Here's another view. Staff follow the advocate all around the building and listen to the conversations with residents. You'd like to be in that place, wouldn't you? So those are just some interesting insights, and you come at this as to how people understand, and obviously there's a fear of the idea of advocacy, of somebody coming in from outside. And that's something that I think can be both dangerous, but it can be grounded in the real experience of some nursing homes in the way that some people have approached advocacy. So our approach in many ways in SAGE is a very pragmatic and hard-nosed as well, and that is to collaborate where possible, and if you won't collaborate, to challenge where necessary. It's just a simple approach. And the key elements of our approach are, first of all, about safety and quality. We want, in light of the experience, where people just simply set up what they called an advocacy service without a thought-through process, we want to put an emphasis on safety for everybody and quality. And to say that support and advocacy are a continuum. And we want to be looking at things like impact, and we want to look at sustainability. And it's for that reason that we are looking at, sorry, there's a slide seemed to have gone missing. I'm going to have to wing this. You're on your own, Mr. President. There's a continuum of support and advocacy. And one shouldn't see it that there's something pure with advocacy and all the outside of that doesn't matter. We would see it that being there for somebody, befriending, can very often be the basis of actually finding out how somebody can give a voice or what's actually at stake. There's also the issue of facilitation, giving a voice to residents in groups, and there's the issue of mediation that relates to that, and sometimes brokering. You're trying to pull together a whole lot of services. Really what people are saying, not necessarily understanding or defining advocate, it's actually about the fact that they just want, as they might say it themselves, a bit of help. And that's actually, we have to find a way to be there, useful. And then we have more formal advocacy, both individual and systemic, but also the specialist area. How do you deal with things like wards of court? And that's an area that we're looking at and trying to grapple with the idea of forming a SAGE legal group, and we will talk about that, be looking at that in the next few weeks, and some of you might be interested in that. One of the ways we're doing that is actually through SAGE representatives, i.e. trained advocates, supported people, facilitators and support people. So 3 different roles, all complementary. Backed up by education, training and support, and proper supervision, and policies and procedures. And then with a strong core organisation. Now that's what we're aiming for. And we are moving, if we're in the red, if this is the red, amber, green, we're in the nursing homes but have a huge amount of work to do there. We've set up an information advice and rapid response phone service for the nursing homes themselves to get in touch with us, because it's very often the nursing homes, they're actually looking for an advocate for a resident themselves, and I have to just say that. And we're exploring how we can get involved in hospitals, in 4 or 5 key hospitals around the country, and we're just literally at the early foothills of exploring how we might get involved in the primary care settings and in homes. And I talked a moment ago about quality and safety. We need to set some standards, and we've already Dr. Michael Brown has started initial scoping work on developing a framework of quality standards for support and advocacy for older people. And there will be a stakeholder consultation and public consultation, and it will be launched at, put this in your diary, October 16th in Croke Park. The European Ombudsman Emily O'Reilly will be speaking, the guest speaker at that event. So we're trying to kind of put in place some various markers of quality to this whole process of support and advocacy. To just deal with some of the challenges, what's going to come up on the screen is actually I think what's happened is two different versions have come here, so I'm cognitive dissonance. I'll do the best I can here. First of all, one of our biggest challenges is to build a strong entity. The joke being the Rock of Sages. What is a sage? An older person. There's a wisdom, judgment, and experience. It doesn't necessarily come with age, but you get the idea. That's where the sage comes. It is not stuffing, it is not payroll. It is about a personal quality, a type of person. And it's also the SA, the support and advocacy, and ageing. But the key thing is about the type of person we are looking for is a sage, because sometimes you would need the wisdom of Solomon. But our key task here is this: to build a team of people capable of tackling the most complex support and advocacy challenges presented by older people. And that is no mean task. And that is the equivalent of what Eamon has been struggling for last year and did actually brilliantly, senior hurling. This is senior hurling for advocacy and support. That's the type of team we have to build, a team of people that can go out in the field and play with the beauty and the music that we saw in the hurling finals last year. It's exactly what we want, and we shouldn't aspire to anything less. People need that. No amateurism. If we need the best, we find the best. If the situation demands we get specialists and we get a ring of volunteers, build a support circle around people, we build it. That's what we have to do. We don't spend time theorising about it. We have to be incredibly practical. And the qualities we are seeking from the people that we want, there's nothing sentimental. There's compassion, there's competence, there's commitment, there's creativity and courage. And you'll see those two words, compassion and competence. Compassion without competence is the sound of one hand clapping. There is no point in emphasising compassion unless you can also emphasise equally competence. You can be hugely compassionate, but not be the right person to actually be with somebody who actually has quite a serious issue to address. The big other challenge that we face is developing circles of support. And that is, how do you build on the natural supports of family? It's not enough just to get involved in somebody's life to a certain point and then saying we're passing you on. Because very often people are coming to us like, it's a bit like the St. Jude box, you know, the lost causes. People have already done an awful lot of, gone through an awful lot of other services before they reach you. So trying to build a circle of support around people is hugely important. And it is to, in many cases, help people to live where they want. Some of our more complex cases have involved getting people from nursing homes or hospitals to live in their home, despite the bulk of the system saying you'll be found dead in the morning, you can't do it, the risk and the family, etc., etc. But the people want that, and we have to work with them. Those are some of the most complex cases, but you can't just leave somebody on their own. You've got to build a circle of support around them. And that has to build on the evidence which comes out of other studies, which effectively show that the most important thing in the well-being of older people is the quality of their relationships. And that ties into a lot of thinking which is coming up from the Carnegie Institute, and thinking about how we might do other models of providing support and services for older people. Social enterprise, for example. But building that it's a unity of family, friends, neighbours and community, local development organisations and healthcare professionals. That can sound wishy-washy, but in fact that's what it takes to actually have somebody live at home or in other circumstances and actually have some quality of life. And that idea of the enabling state and a diversity of models, I think, is hugely important. All we have at the moment is very often an outsourced model or a direct state provision. And we need to have, just as we have separation of powers legally, we need to have an idea to develop a concept of a separation of economic powers, so that we have a state sector, we have a private sector, but we have another sector as well that can actually blend and use ideas of business for a good social purpose. I'd want, and I'm conscious of time, but I just want to kind of, we've a few years now into the experience of HICWA as regulator. I just want to ask a few questions about that. The first thing is, if you add it all together, there's a social market there. The state provides 1.1 billion, and the citizens, well, who provide that billion in the first place, but directly the older people probably contribute around 0.25 billion in addition through the Fair Deal. Now, that goes on about, that's the vast majority of spending for older people for less than 5% of older people. And I just want to raise a question, and just to start some questioning about, and it's a challenge, I think, that an organisation such as SAGE needs to take up, is to, you know, we're frequently asking questions about the state provider and the private providers, but also it isn't unreasonable to ask, in the light of the experience of some of our clients, what is the role of the regulator? Is it, in fact, is HICWA in fact a regulator, or is it an inspectorate? Are they actually regulating the price, as another regulator might? No, because it's the NTPF, the National Treatment Purchase Fund, that actually decides all of those things and does the negotiation. There's also the fact that a nursing home, you can go through those freedom of information, there's a copy in my bag, but you can actually go through those and you'll see one of the big issues is shortages of staff, people not being available at the right time. And then the question is, well, if you're the regulator, who's looking in the books of your company, because the vast majority of provision in nursing homes is now private, a few voluntary, but who's looking in the books to see, actually, you have very little staff and there's complaints about staff, but what's your returns? So what is the role of a regulator there? You don't look at the economic picture at all. And that strikes me as strange given the role of a regulator. And there's also the thing about the function creep, and I think that is a kind of it's a grey area and it's for discussion, but the social housing sector feel that because there's supports coming in with social housing, that in some way HICWA is coming in, and you get this stage where, well, it's my house. No, but actually there's supports coming in, and we're getting into, this is a quasi-nursing home. No, it's really my house. There is a question about function creep, which needs, it's not that I wish to tear strips off HICWA, quite the opposite. I think it has had, on the balance, a profoundly positive impact. But it is simply to raise the question, it is a public body, it is up for, its role should be discussed. And it is responsible for a sector where we're spending 1.25 billion, certainly 1 billion of state funds, and there's 13 billion of state funds goes into the entire health budget. And it's also to raise another question about the compliance and quality improvement culture. There is a difficulty, I think, with this thing about inspecting, that you reinforce the behaviours that you might actually want to end, which is that people are, can you show compliance, document, all of that. But it's a focus on task, and it may be driving a kind of a focus away from the actual quality of relationships. And you don't actually know about quality of relationships unless you actually spend time in a place. And some of the better private providers have actually said to me recently about their concern that they used to get 2 inspectors, now they get 1, and that one person has to do an awful lot of the time on documentation. So there are questions to be asked there. And there's one question I want to ask is why, if we're a health information and quality authority, I cannot get a list, a simple list of all of the designated centres from HICWA. So we will have our list shortly and we will send it to HICWA. The last point I want to make, and it's not just because Eamon is here, but there's a very good article in The Economist just after Christmas, a long way from dismal, and it makes the point about how microeconomists could actually play a role in looking more close. Instead of theoretical macroeconomic models, you might actually use microeconomists' data in the here and now to actually achieve more. And I think if you look at 22,000 people, the town of Sligo in population terms, $1 billion is spent. Wouldn't it be useful if we actually had some economists, microeconomists as well, looking at that and seeing are there other ways that we could achieve more. There are just some questions I think it's worth raising, seeing as I'm raising questions in relation to other situations. And this is one for employment lawyers, a challenge. You'll recognise, I hope, that still from the Ars Attracta. I say this not as a lawyer, and I say it in ignorance, but I have a sense that if they were two kids on Talbot Street and they were caught doing that, they would have seen a judge a long while ago. And it is strange, and there is an issue of due process, yes, and it has been explained to me at great length, and I do understand it, the need for fairness. But I do also understand that in many ways that there are messages can be sent out through what you see as the process of due process. So again, there might be a way that we can actually look at some of these issues, because how many times do you need to actually review the video footage, literally footage, of what went on there? Another challenge I just want to raise is very quickly the issue of whether, in fact, a lot of criticism is made of nursing homes. But really the issue may be, should we be looking at what it is about the nursing profession? I was really taken by the fact I went down to Moore Hall. It was featured on TV3 recently about nursing homes where they got rid of the uniforms, the drug trolley. They tried to develop more of a household model, and asking one of the key people involved, had he had many nursing homes come to see how they were working the household model, and to discover that in fact he was feeling rather dejected because they didn't understand how staff could be expected to wear pyjamas to fit in with people who are actually seeing, patients with dementia, residents with dementia. Didn't see how you could do without uniforms. Didn't see how you could actually, do ironing with somebody because that was somebody else's job. And these are supposedly your houses, your homes from home. Why do you have people in your house, unless you're a fetishist, you don't go around wearing nurses' uniforms. Some people weren't laughing. Very quickly, there are kind of just a few other challenges, particularly as we move into hospitals. There is this issue of the walkie-talkies, the people like me who are, if you like, vertical, and you're walking around. For alone, vulnerable older people, particularly at the moment in EDs, there is that problem. The world is, you're looking at the lights. You're probably finding it hard to hear, or you're completely overwhelmed by sounds, people passing you by, and extremely, even for the healthiest person, just lie on the broad of your back, be wheeled in a trolley or in a wheelchair. Everything changes. And to add to that, great illness, urinary tract infection, confusion. You could not design a system of sensory deprivation, such as that's the experience. And that's actually what is actually happening. So how we work and explore that is going to be very difficult, because one of our problems is we're trying to have support people to be there for those vulnerable older people, because people are saying we want this. Where would we stand in the last few weeks in Beaumont? There wouldn't be room. And again, that is a serious kind of challenge. In the primary care sector, the home care sector, one of the things that the review of Fair Deal is coming up, that may bring the challenge of the extension of long-term care in the home actually coming in under Fair Deal. I don't know if it's too close to the election to bring that in, but it may happen. That will bring a lot of challenges. But also something I want to signal is the move towards personalisation or individualisation, payments for carers, etc. You hire the person you want. And absolutely, in principle, I agree with that, and we would all agree with that. You're in charge. But hold on. You have 3 people living in what we might call the keyhole of a council estate. And there's 1.5 hours there allocated from one company, and there's 3 hours here allocated by another company, and there's 4 hours from another. Nobody is joining up the dots. there's a loss of social capital, there's a loss of community building. That doesn't necessarily make sense. So the kind of slogan of individual needs, yes, but collective responses has to be the way that we should approach these challenges. One of the final things I want to identify is the emergence. You may hear this term, you know that there's emerging in the next while. You'll be aware that there's a challenge from HICWA's regulations that they may close an awful lot of private nursing homes or community hospitals. I've heard from some sources that the word or term subacute is coming in, whatever that is. Sean might explain it to you later. But in fact, nobody's quite sure. But it may be a way of redesignating some places so that they can actually extend their opening time. But there's a lot of focus on it's going to, such and such a town is going to lose its nursing home or its community hospital. But we need to focus on the residents, because there's a fair amount of evidence that moving people without involving them in the process actually shortens their lives. Now, how can you bring in standards for safety and quality and shorten somebody's life in the other process? So there is a challenge there, and there's an issue to be faced. I think the other, and it's a kind of concluding sort of point, in all of this, I've been talking about advocacy, support and advocacy, finding people's voice. But on its own, this idea of advocacy, I think it will not succeed. It needs to be part of a wider process of linking the public, the personal voice, with a questioning in the public interest. And that is about, we're used to the term multidisciplinary teams, but it's something that we developed, or we talked, and you know, for some people it worked in hospice-friendly hospitals, multi-perspective approach, so that you had a public interest representative on the standing committees of all the people in the hospital to do with end-of-life care. And you had somebody who was there in the public interest who actually asked hard questions, who wasn't Mr. Tame or Mrs. Angry. You know, everything was great. My granny had a wonderful experience in this hospital, and sure, the nurses are angels and the doctors are wonderful, and isn't it grand? And then there's the other one whose granny broke her hip, and consequently, no matter what happened in the hospital, whether they did brilliant brain surgery or just did everything wonderfully, it all comes down to your granny breaking the hip. Those kind of stereotypical kind of just putting people tokenistically on sort of patient councils, it has its limitations. So we need to find a way to bring in the voice of people, coming back to the original advocara, into the system. And one way of doing that, apart from advocacy, is experience-based design, where you actually involve the users of the system in how the system is designed. And it can be done in small ways, because in clinical terms and in organisational terms, and you know the phrase power corrupts and PowerPoint corrupts absolutely, the map for the withdrawal from Afghanistan was a wonderful piece of PowerPoint, but nobody could actually understand it. There are clinical care pathways that are brilliant and work wonderfully, but there are also clinical care pathways that are just totally aspirational, because they actually have no engagement with the lived experience of people of the system. So we need to join this. It's the co-creation piece. That's a way of giving people voice, because in the end of the day, I say this very simply, we have a contribution to make. But if I had a choice between 10 good advocates and 1 good leader in a nursing home, I would choose 1 good leader. It is not an achievement to have 10 advocates working on 100 problems, and it makes everyone feel happy that we are achieving something. It's actually awful. And that is something that we need to be cognizant of ourselves as we develop, that it is not about us. It is about what the system demands. So we have to link the voice of the individual with a more structural piece of actually asking questions in the public interest. And my last point is to advise all of you to keep taking the tablets and the smartphones, because I started with Lee's Cross and the bleak house that it was, and then we talked about the bleak house of Ars Attracta, and they've all been filmed within a decade, bookends of a decade. They've been filmed by the national broadcaster. I would strongly suspect, and there's evidence I'm seeing out there, small but it's growing, of older people using their smartphones and families using phones, and that the next ugly incidents that you may watch may actually be on social media. And that will put a completely new dynamic, because what that will do is it will release us all. It will have a detrimental effect in some respects, and people will cry, oh, it's not true, and taken out of context. The fact of the matter is, it might break through this whole logjam of inquiries, all of those things. People will not go to X place. There will be change, because guess what? Money will dictate. And that's the question I want to just leave with you. Advocacy has a role to play, but it is only one part of a wider process of questioning, of giving voice, and of change. Thank you very much indeed.